The next thing we sort of need to talk about is Quebec's famous Bill 101. This is sort of a setup to Quebec's 1980 referendum. So I imagine, at least by now, some of you have sort of caught glimpses of this idea of Bill 101. And this is a law in Quebec that is intended to protect and promote the use of the French language. So it regulates a number of things that are sort of trivial, and then some things that are kind of less trivial. And so one of the things you're going to see most immediately if you're ever in Quebec is that Bill 101 regulates signage. So, for example, it's totally permissible to have a sign that is only in French. That's fine. If you want to have a sign that's bilingual, then Bill 101 introduces some regulation around that. So, for example, the French text needs to be first, the French text needs to be larger. There's all of these rules about like relative font sizes and that kind of stuff. If you want to have a sign in a language other than French, that's fine too, but again, you need to have the French sort of prominent and displayed. And that's an intended sort of piece to ensure that when people move to Quebec, the French language is something that they use every day. So we've talked a little bit in this class about what sort of the challenges are of trying to learn French meaningfully when you get, for example, 2 hours of classes a week from grade 4 through grade 6, and then sort of expecting everyone to be bilingual, and that doesn't really work. And we've already talked a little bit about some of the sort of need to have public spaces engaged in French. We need to have a lot of discussions around that kind of thing as well. So that's the sort of more, I don't want to say trivial, because it's sort of the like easier to manage stuff. The other part of Bill 101 that is, shall we say, more contentious is that Bill 101 regulates access to English language education inside the province of Quebec. So if you want to have access to Quebec's Anglophone schools, if you want to educate your child where the language of instruction is English in Quebec, Bill 101 restricts access to that kind of education to children whose parents were educated in English, one, which sort of makes sense, and educated in English inside Quebec. And what that basically means is that if you are immigrating from anywhere outside of Quebec and you settle in Quebec, your children are going to school where the language of instruction is French, at least if you're going to go into the public school system. And this is a really intentional strategy on the part of the government of Quebec, partially because this is a precursor to the 1980 referendum, and things have changed a little bit since then. But this is a conversation about how Quebec managed not having control of its own immigration policy, in that the federal government was attracting and deciding who did and did not immigrate. And that meant that they weren't necessarily attracting a ton of francophones, and they weren't encouraging those francophones to settle in Quebec. So there was a concern that with prolonged immigration, and if you arrived in Canada speaking neither French nor English, that immigrants would simply choose to learn to speak English, and that in that sort of way, the francophone character of Quebec would wind up being eroded sort of over the long term. This is a pretty contentious one, and it sort of this is the reason that the notwithstanding clause gets invoked on this law after 1982. We can talk about that for a little bit, but that's the sort of conversation, is that that's what that law is supposed to do. I will also sort of highlight some things that this doesn't affect everything. So there are, for example, some cultural institutions within Quebec that are Anglophone. McGill University is one of them. So if you go to McGill, you're getting an education in English. And they basically just sort of like wrote exceptions into Bill 101, in that they're like, no, McGill is an Anglophone university, and that's just the way that it's going to go. Concordia is in French, McGill can be in English, and that's fine, and we're just going to sort of leave it alone. And for example, McGill still does its own admissions, and so they're not subject to that requirement about you can't go here unless your parents were educated in Quebec in English. So that sort of attempt and that sort of sentiment about the need to protect the French language inside Quebec is a big precursor to the 1980 referendum. So we'll sort of run by some very quick names, some of which you will probably recognize as we sort of do this. The Yes sort of separatists are headed by René Lévesque as the leader of the Bloc Québécois, no, not of the Bloc Québécois, of the Parti Québécois, the PQ, and Jacques Parizeau, whose name comes up later. We'll talk about him for 1995, but they are sort of leading the provincial sort of separation campaign in 1980. And they're proposing a version of sovereignty that has some form of association. So this is what the French would call souveraineté association, so sovereignty association, roughly. Um, and the idea is that when they're negotiating a separation within Canada, like from Canada, they're talking about keeping a common currency. So again, sort of similar to what they're talking about, to what sort of the European Union does, sort of a common currency. They're also sort of negotiating they're also sort of suggesting that there would be some negotiations with Canada and the government of Canada as to what that would look like, and that those results would only be official following a second referendum. Sort of when the negotiations are complete, they'll come back to the referendum and do that again. You can sort of see the specifics of that question. I put the text of it up in the PowerPoint presentation because I wasn't going to read it to you. So when I sort of talked in our last video about that idea that like there's different visions of what sovereignty actually is, this is an example of that. So this is the vision of sovereignty that you sort of get in 1980, that like, yeah, we'll keep the common currency, we'll negotiate what this looks like, and it's not that we're going to completely cut ourselves off from Canada, we just need a way to negotiate some more autonomy in our own sort of space. There are really two parties who are proposing the vote no, i.e. the vote to stay in Canada side of this negotiation. One of them is run by the leader of Quebec's Liberal Party. His name is Claude Ryan. And that is probably all you're ever going to know about this man. There are some specialists who do some in-depth work on him, but for most people, that's probably all you're ever going to know about this man. You will probably recognize the names in the other sort of big campaign in terms of voting no, in that the federal government ran a number of events to encourage the population of Quebec to vote to remain in Canada, and that campaign is headed by Pierre Trudeau, who's the Prime Minister, again, probably a name you recognize by this point, and Jean Chrétien as the Justice Minister, again, probably a name that you recognize. And when we talked a little bit about Trudeau and being pretty charismatic around the Constitution, this is another place where that shows up. In that, again, Trudeau is an incredibly charismatic man, and there was sort of like Trudeau mania. He would go places and have rallies and have screaming women and that kind of thing. So when Trudeau is running rallies to sort of support the no side of this referendum, you wind up with political rallies that look a little bit more like Beatles concerts. And that's a big threat because René Lévesque and Jacques Parizeau are not charismatic in that way. So they don't make people as excited. And again, Pierre Trudeau is a very charismatic man, and so there's some really lovely footage of him, for example, talking to a crowd of really, really, really pumped up Québécois, talking about how like he is the perfect model of Canada because he's Pierre, but he's also Elliot. And that marriage of languages and cultures is what we're going for, and that it's reality and all this sort of stuff. So there's this pretty powerful federal campaign that is run to encourage people to vote no, i.e. to vote remain within the country of Canada. And just the existence of that campaign, or more, the formal statements are that it's about the existence of that campaign. I think that a probably better statement would be that campaign was reading as relatively successful, and that campaign had an amount of charisma and was sort of relatively successful, rather than sort of just being the government mailing you random pamphlets, because they think that they probably wouldn't have complained about that so much. But in that sort of case, Quebec, the separatists in Quebec actually are really upset that federal campaign on the part of the federal government exists, because from their perspective, and again, this will sort of echo what we were talking about when we talked about the FLQ, this is a provincial matter, and the federal government has no standing and no reason to intervene. The sort of flip side of that argument, coming from the federal government, is that makes our country economically unstable if you leave. We absolutely have a right to sort of campaign to sort of prevent that. That is sort of a distinction and a tension that doesn't ever really get resolved. There's still a lot of disagreements about whether that's allowable, whether that should happen, that kind of thing. But so you understand that there's two different perspectives about that in terms of the government of Quebec saying, oh, you can't do that, and then the government of and then Ottawa saying, we have every right to do that because this is what's happening and affects us too. So results-wise, I've got a couple of things to say about this. As you might guess from the fact that Quebec is still a province in Canada, the no sort of side wins here. And in that sort of space, you get about a 60-40 split. So it's like 59.5% of the eligible voters cast their ballot to remain within Canada. And this is, in a lot of ways, the precursor to the 1982 Constitution, because Pierre Trudeau sort of talks about that moment, the result of that referendum, as a mandate to sort of renew the Canadian Confederation and to sort of create a country that works. And from his perspective, that's what happens. We've already talked about sort of Quebec's perspective and the sort of need for the Lake Mead Accord and the Charlotte Towns Accord to try and fix the problems in terms of Quebec's place in Confederation. But from Trudeau's perspective, he's fixed it, right? Because Trudeau's perspective was that what you needed to solve this problem was a stronger federal government. There are just a number of people around who disagreed with that idea. So that's sort of the results piece. And when we talk about 59.5% of the population voting to say remain within Canada, that's fine. But one of the other things that I really want to talk to you about is the voter turnout piece, because this is sort of common knowledge in like political sociology and the people who study elections, but it's not for most students who are coming in sort of with nothing in this area. A good voter turnout in an election today is somewhere around 43-45%. Just the way that it goes. Like, as much as we sort of talk about it in a contemporary election, a good turnout is around 40%. Many elections you'll see more like 30-35. So if anyone ever tells you that their vote doesn't count, please be aware that they're 100% wrong, because there's a whole lot of people who don't vote, who could definitely swing the results of any election sort of in question. That said, in the 1980 referendum, the voter turnout is 85.5%, or yes, 85.5%, which, if you sort of do the math, is really, really, really high. And we could talk a lot about sort of what those numbers mean, but the important thing is to understand that one of the things that number means is that this is a really, really important question in Quebec. And it's really important actually on both sides, right? Because if it's really important only one side, then you would see sort of like 70% of the population voting one way, or something like that. 70% of the voters voting one way. And it's not. It's a pretty even 60-40 kind of split. And what that tells you is that there are people who live in Quebec who feel very strongly about Quebec needing to become independent and sort of separating from Canada. But that there are also people in Quebec who feel very strongly that Quebec's place is as a province in Canada. And that's an important piece to understand, because it tells you something. Especially in Alberta, it's really common to sort of describe, well, Quebec feels like this. And that's not what's happening. There are a lot of divided opinions in Quebec, and especially around this. We'll sort of talk about this when we talk about nationalism, Quebec nationalism a little later on. But there are lots of really divided opinions about that, and it's important that you understand that that is the case.